we can all agree that cooperation is a bit of an evolutionary puzzle because individuals are taking on a cost to provide a benefit to somebody else. So, all else equal, individuals who are not going to pay the cost but take the benefit are going to do better. So, one of the major successes of evolutionary biology has been that it has been able to explain cooperative behavior in the animal kingdom. And the two main explanations, kin selection. Kin selection basically says that cooperation can evolve if individuals preferentially direct their cooperative acts towards close kin. And a reciprocity specifies that individuals can, if individuals basically conditionally cooperate with those who cooperated with them in the past, then cooperators can have a higher fitness than defectors. And as a result of this, most of the cooperation in the animal kingdom is restricted to small groups of kin or to individuals who are interacting repeatedly with each other. As we know, human cooperation simply doesn't fit this pattern. It cannot, all of it cannot be explained by kin selection and reciprocity because humans cooperate in very large groups of genetically unrelated individuals, and we cooperate in transient interactions with strangers. I've been studying this in the context of warfare because if cooperation is an evolutionary puzzle, then warfare is one of the starkest renditions of this puzzle because individuals are literally giving up their life and their limb in order to create a benefit that flows not just to them, but to a larger group of people. And as a result of this, warfare is actually very rare in the animal kingdom, despite the fact that interpersonal violence is very common. Now, we do have a couple exceptions. So chimps are known to form raiding parties that launch attacks on neighboring communities. But one important thing to notice is that in all the years of studying chimpanzees, researchers haven't documented a single instance in which a chimp from the attacking party has been injured or killed. And that's because when chimps go on these raids, they're basically assessing conditions that drastically minimize the risk of the attackers. And also, all the chimps who go on a raid are from the same community. And so even if they're not all kin, they are at least individuals who know each other and will interact again in the future. Now, eusocial insects such as ants do engage in intercolony battles in which you can have thousands or millions of ants being killed from the attacking party. But one thing to note is that none of the ants who die in battle are individuals who can have reproduced. They're sterile individuals that are giving up their life to increase the fitness of their reproductive kin. But in human warfare, the dead soldiers on a battlefield are individuals who are often unrelated, who do not know each other very well, who, had they not died in warfare, could have gone on to have children. They're often young men in their reproductive age who are giving up their lives. And this makes human warfare extremely unusual in the animal kingdom. Now, one intuition and very plausible explanation that people have is that such spectacular forms of cooperation, especially in the context of warfare, is probably a result of political centralization. So once you have formal centralized governments or authorities that can coerce people and enforce rules, then people might be motivated to actually comply with these rules and make these sacrifices for their social group. So, in order to assess the scale and scope of human cooperation and warfare when political institutions are absent, I've been, as Pete said, studying the Turkana up in northern Kenya. So the area in pink over here is where the Turkana live. And the area in red over here is approximately the area that I conduct my fieldwork in, which, as you can see, is very close to the border with South Sudan and Uganda. So the Turkana number about 1 million people, and they are semi-nomadic pastoralists. They're making a living herding cattle, camels, sheep, goat. They use donkeys as pack animals. And they're limited by access to dry season water wells and pastures. And as a result, they live in temporary settlements, constructing homesteads such as these. And they periodically pack up their belongings and they migrate to new areas to access fresh pastures and water wells. The Turkana also engage in cattle raids against neighboring pastoral groups. And the main purpose of these raids is to acquire cattle. Some of the cattle are cattle that they have lost in raids against them by the neighboring pastoral groups, and also to get access to key dry season territories that have fresh pastures and water wells even during the dry season. Now, one aspect of my work has shown that participation in these raids is costly. So individuals are bearing a substantial cost when they go on raids. 40% of warriors in my sample had sustained bullet injuries. The average mortality on each raid, I have estimated based on 88 raids, is about 1%. About 50% of adult male mortality in the area that I was working in is from warfare. About 55% of it is from offensive warfare and about 45% from defensive warfare in which the Turkana are being attacked. And 1 out of 5 of all male children who are born end up dying in warfare. So now these last two statistics are will not be true for Turkana who live far away from the border, but in the area that I'm working in, which is the Kwatela population close to the border with South Sudan, people are making a livelihood living close to the border, and they are taking these levels of risks. Individuals are taking these levels of risks. So, and not only this, the raiding parties that they form are fairly large. So the mean number of warriors in these big battle raids are about 315. And as you can see, some raids are even larger, involving 600, 800,000, up to 1,200 individuals. And for an individual warrior, only 1% of the raiding party is his close kin. And there are many individuals on the raid that he will not know. So if you ask a warrior, did you know a lot of people on this raid? He'll say, well, I knew the people who were from my settlement, who were from my territorial area. I knew the people from my age group, and then I knew a few other people from these other areas, but there were many people who came from far away that I don't know, and I certainly don't know very well. So we have individuals taking on substantial costs in a very large group of people that are unrelated and people that they don't know very well. So there is a collective action problem in these raids. And consistent with that, the Turkana also report that free riding is an issue on these raids. They say that there are many instances of cowardice on the battlefield, so issues with people who are lagging behind their fellow combatants, who are not firing their weapon, who are running away when the firefight gets intense, or there are instances of desertion where individuals join the raiding party, but along the way, as the raiding party is traveling, to to the opponent's area, they simply have disappeared. They've headed back home. And a very conspicuous problem is also the problem of loot grabbing. So when these large battle raids are being launched, if they're successful, there can be thousands of cattle that are being driven back to Turkana area. And the normative way of loot sharing is for individuals to then divide it among different age groups. And then within the age group, there's further subdivisions. And then after they go back to their settlements, there are further norms about sharing. But oftentimes, as the cattle are being driven away, individuals have a lot of opportunities for them to just grab some of the cattle and start driving them back on their own as their personal property. So how is cooperation maintained in these raids? It turns out that consistent with a large body of literature that comes mostly from behavioral economics, peer sanctioning of free riders plays a very important role in the society in deterring free riding. So ordinary Turkana citizens, men who go on the raids, men who don't go on the raids, women, young unmarried women, older married women, are playing a role in enforcing certain social norms that can help sustain cooperation on these raids. So, for instance, here is a vignette experiment in which I presented members of the community with a hypothetical scenario in which the Turkana go on a battle raid, and there is somebody who displayed cowardice on the battlefield. He lags behind others. He didn't fire his weapon, and he ran away when the firefight got intense. And people do have negative moral judgments that they're making towards this individual. So they say that what this individual did is wrong. They feel displeased by his action. They want to criticize him. They think that he should be punished in some way. They wouldn't want to stand near him in a raid. They don't want to entrust their herds with him. They don't want to lend him an animal. They won't let their daughter marry him, or at least some people are saying that. And if you are making a livelihood based on subsistence pastoralism, you're often going to lose your animals to raids and epidemics and droughts. And the only way that you can recover from these big major losses is if you can borrow animals from other people. So for instance, if a coward is any more likely to be not given an animal at a time in which he needs it, it's going to have a significant impact on his ability to thrive. So now you might think that, well, many of these need not have to do with moral, kind of third-party moral judgments about free riding, but more about individuals not wanting to associate with somebody who's a coward because they are not going to be useful social partners for you. So kind of some strategic partner choice type of sentiments. But here what I have in blue is people's reactions towards an unskilled warrior. So this is a vignette experiment that was very similar to the previous one, but here the individual did not contribute because he was not skilled. So he goes on the raid, he puts in the effort, but because he did not have the skills, he wasn't able to help his age mates, and as a result, the age mates could not succeed on this raid. And people don't have the same sentiments towards this person, even though, it won't be a great idea to stand next to this person on a raid, or to entrust your animals with him, or to trust your daughter, have your daughter marry him. People just don't have the same kinds of negative sentiments, which suggests that the norms about what to do, the right and wrong thing to do in combat in this society, has more to do with free riding. that is decisions of individuals to withhold contributions in order to lower the personal cost that they're taking for a group benefit. And these moral sentiments do lead to real sanctions. And in the Turkana context, the main kind of direct sanctioning occurs in the form of, first, a lot of talk, so a lot of ridicule, a lot of criticism, admonishings towards the person who's done the wrongdoing by everyone in the community, women, elders, etc. And in some of these cases, after the talk has kind of converged, people might decide to dispense corporal punishment on a wrongdoer. And that's when a group of his age mates will get together and they beat or whip the person who's committed the wrongdoing as a way to correct him. So they think of this as a form of discipline, which means that they expect that the person will change his behavior and be able to rejoin the fold in some ways. And also fines in which a wrongdoer has to basically sacrifice an animal from his herd in order to atone for his wrongdoing. Now, not everybody gets punished for a wrongdoing, and there are many reasons for that, including that sometimes once the collective decision making, when a lot of people are talking, you might hear different perspectives. Somebody might justify this person's actions as having actually been right. They might disagree with the people who accuse him of wrongdoing, etc. But here I'm going to focus on one particular reason that has come up when people have talked to me about why sometimes certain individuals didn't get punished. And so this is one subject's response. He says, he may be a friend that donates us a goat the next time we go on a raid, or we may marry their family. And so what the subject is describing is essentially the second order free rider problem. That is, the benefits of engaging in disciplinary action towards a member of your group are going to be experienced by the entire group, regardless of whether you participate in the punishment or not. Yet there are substantial costs to punishing. So there is the cost of time and effort that you spend, taking time away from other activities. But most conspicuously, there is a social cost in which you're severing some very important and valuable social ties that, who knows, might be really important in the future. So to understand how in a decentralized society people are motivated to punish, I've done a series of vignette experiments to assess essentially, has cultural evolution created norms or meta-norms about norm enforcement that essentially promote pro-social punishment and deter anti-social punishment? And if the answer to that is yes, we can begin to understand how you get how the system of peer punishment, third-party punishment, might have evolved. So here is a vignette experiment in which I told participants about a scenario in which the Turkana go on a raid. And in one condition, an individual observes somebody who's displaying cowardice, but he doesn't do anything about it. So that's going to be shown in blue. And in yellow, in the exact same situation, the individual who observed the cowardice goes back. When he goes back home, he reports it to the age mates and discusses it, and the appropriate sanctions towards the cowardice is initiated. And as you can see, the individual who does not punish, who ignores this wrongdoing, doesn't do anything about it, is viewed negatively in somewhat the same way as a first order free rider, the coward, was being viewed. And the individual who initiates sanctions does not have these same kinds of negative sentiments being directed towards him. And that's not all there is. There are additionally strong negative sentiments towards an individual who observes a wrongdoing but punishes in excess. So that's shown in these orange bars here. And most strongly, individuals who falsely accuse somebody and therefore allow an innocent individual to be punished is somebody who's seen as having done something really wrong. So it's not just that there are norms promoting pro-social punishment, but there are also norms that limit and restrict the extent to which you can punish and the abuse of punishment, which potentially is really important when you're allowing, when norms are basically authorizing individuals to engage in violence against other individuals. And in addition, we have norms against counter punishment that are interesting. So in blue, I'm showing you how people think about an individual who actually retaliates against the people who punished him. And in blue is basically when the person is retaliating against punishments that he deserved. And in yellow is retaliation against punishment that he didn't deserve. And what you can see here is that third parties are essentially authorizing second parties to retaliate against a person who has engaged in wrongful punishment. So again, you have certain norms that might be promoting pro-social punishment and deterring antisocial punishment. And another really interesting thing that I've documented is that people have very strong negative sentiments towards a punisher who acts alone. So what this bar is showing is the additional proportion of people who judge a punisher's act as wrong if the punisher followed all the other steps. That is, he's observed cowardice, he went back, he reported to his age mates, but he engaged in the act of disciplining on his own. And regardless of whether that punishment was deserved, people immediately say that this is no longer discipline. And they had very strong responses about this. They said, if that's what he's doing, then it's a fight. It doesn't matter whether the wrongdoer did something wrong. If you do it alone, it's no longer kind of within the domain of disciplining. It's a fight. And I thought this was very interesting, partly because one potential reason that has been posited for why punishment often is collective is that it reduces the cost to individuals of having to engage in punishment. But what this result shows is that in addition, there might be another very important reason why punishment, peer punishment, often requires this collective component, and that is to ensure that punishment is legitimate and just and is seen and occurs in the context of actual correction and is not being abused by individuals for personal gain. And there were also negative sentiments towards punishers who were not from a preordained group. So in the Turkana context, age mates are supposed to punish wrongdoings regarding raids, herding negligences, and a few other contexts. And clan members are supposed to punish certain other violations, especially of marital norms. And if you have a senior age group kind of overstep and punish somebody from the junior age group without having sought the consensus of the junior age group, that also is seen as wrong. So there are a lot of norms that are regulating both promoting and restricting the kinds of punishment that people can engage in. So what these results show is that um, decentralized punishment is not a system, is not necessarily a system in which anyone can do what they want when they feel they want to punish. But it is actually potentially a highly regulated system. And it's possible that the types of antisocial punishment that we see in experiments that has gained a lot of attention might be due to the fact that in centralized societies with formal courts, etc., there are norms. You don't really have selection for these kinds of decentralized third-party norms, and basically the breakdown of these norms is leading to patterns of behavior that are surprising when you think about punishment as a pro-social, third-party punishment as a pro-social enterprise. So to conclude this little segment, what I've shown is that the Turkana have culturally evolved norms to mitigate second-order free riding and promote pro-social punishment. So essentially, cultural evolution is creating norms and meta-norms that are helping to solve first-order and second-order free rider problems. There, interestingly, are no reports of actual punishment of second-order free riders, even though people have these strong negative sentiments. I haven't heard of actual reports in which this has happened, which is quite different from what happens in the first-order free riding, where you do see the sentiments mapping on to what's happening. And my guess is that it's because second-order free riding is a crime of omission than a crime of commission, and so it makes it hard to actually detect and know for sure whether somebody was not punishing. But I can talk more about that in the Q&A. So now the question is, how are these kinds of norms evolving? And in order to explain, shed light on that, we need to explain what can explain the scale of cooperation, because the scale of cooperation can give us some insight into the selection pressures that have led to the types of cooperation we see in humans, just like kin selection makes predictions about a particular scale of cooperation, reciprocity makes predictions about the scale of cooperation. What essentially is creating these norms? We clearly are seeing cooperative outcomes in human societies, but what's the process? And to understand this process, we need to know what exactly is the scale, because large-scale cooperation can still occur at various different scales. And you can have norms that sustain any kind of cooperative behavior or even non-cooperative behavior. So you could have a norm that says, don't steal your village members' cattle, but the cattle of other villages, those are for brave warriors to steal. Or you can have a norm that says, do not steal your clan members' cattle, but the cattle of other clans are for brave warriors to steal. And both these norms will sustain cooperation, but at different scales. So to motivate this problem a little further, let me give you an example of a vignette experiment that I did back in the day. Here I presented Quatella subjects. So these are the subjects who I work with a scenario in which two Quatella warriors go off to Toposa and raid animals from the Toposa and bring those animals back and share it with the Quatella people. In another scenario, I presented them the exact same situation, except the two warriors go to a neighboring Turkana territory called the Lukumong, and they raid animals from the Lukumong and bring them back to Quatella. And they share the animals with Quatella. So in both situations, the Quatella are benefiting. These are the subjects who are responding to these vignette scenarios are responding. Yet, what we see is that people have very strong negative sentiments towards the warriors who go and raid another Turkana territorial section. And in contrast, they actually had very positive things to say about the warriors who go and raid the Toposa. They say they've done the right thing, they should be praised, etc. And I should note that the Cuartela itself are a very large group of people. So they easily number about 50 to 100,000 people. And so cooperation within the scale of the Cuartela is still extremely large scale cooperation. But somehow the Turkana have, the Cuartela seem to have norms that in moral norms about, who to harm or hurt that include the Lukumong and deter wrong raiding the Lukumong, and they don't have these norms towards the Toposa. So, what exactly is determining the scale at which these norms are producing pro-social outcomes is the question that's at stake here. And in this particular example, you might think that the ethnolinguistic group seems to be an important boundary, but why is the ethnolinguistic group important? And is this something that reoccurs in the context of other norms and in the context of other societies? And if we can get some insight into that question, we start to understand what might be the processes that shape human cooperative norms. And one theory that does make explicit predictions about the scale of large-scale cooperation is cultural group selection theory. And here, the basic idea is that competition between groups with different cultural norms and institutions can lead to the spread of norms and institutions that benefit the cultural group. Now, cultural group selection theory makes two predictions. One is that between group cultural variation will be higher than between group genetic variation. And that's essentially what's going to allow culture to do something that genes cannot do, because we know that genetic variation between groups is very minimal, too low to favor any kind of large-scale cooperative behaviors. Otherwise, you would see plenty of cooperation in the animal kingdom. So one assumption of the theory is that, cultural variation should be substantial between group cultural variation. And a second prediction then is that if this type of variation and the competition that results between variable cultural groups is shaping cooperation, then the scale of cooperation should coincide with the scale of cultural similarity. So to do this, we used a metric called cultural FST, which is essentially the proportion of the variation in cultural traits that lies between groups. So it's the ratio of between group variation over total variation. And now to link cultural FST to the scale of cooperation, we needed to measure cooperation and cultural variation at multiple social scales. So to explain the logic of that a little bit more, let's consider two hypothetical groups like this. Let's say that these are two ethnolinguistic groups. And within these groups, there are other nested groups, like, for instance, clans nested within ethnolinguistic groups. Now, if a lot of the cultural variation in traits lies between clans, then cultural group selection should be mostly operating between clans, and it should favor behaviors that promote cooperation with clan members, even if it comes at the expense of other clans. Alternately, if most of the cultural variation lies at the ethnolinguistic scale and there isn't as much cultural variation between clans, then you should get between group selection mostly acting at the level of ethnolinguistic groups, and such selection is going to favor norms that promote cooperation across clans for the benefit of the ethnolinguistic group, even if it comes at the expense of other ethnolinguistic groups. So we had three goals in this study. One is to measure cultural differentiation at different social scales, assess the social scale at which people cooperate, and then map the scale of cultural differentiation with the scale of cooperation. And to do this, I collaborated with Carla Handley, who was a postdoc at ASU at the time. And Carla has spent about 15 years working with three pastoral groups that neighbor the Turkana, the Samburu, the Borana, and the Rendille. And so we combined these field sites, and we were able to do a study that spanned 4 different ethno-linguistic groups, all practicing semi-arid, semi-nomadic pastoralism, and have decentralized political authority. So in some ways, we felt this is a very suitable and interesting context to assess cooperation and cultural group selection, partly because these are all politically decentralized societies. So most of the normative evolution is basically bottom-up processes, not top-down enforcement. They're natural fertility populations that are experiencing population growth and are competing very intensively for livestock, grazing, and water wells that impact population growth. And they all participate in intergroup raids that affect the availability of resources that the groups have and the extent of population growth they can sustain. So we sampled 750 individuals in total from 4 ethnic groups. And from each of these groups, we sampled individuals from different clans, 2 different clans of the Rendille, Samburu, and Borana. And for the Turkana, we sampled 3 different clans. And we additionally, in the Turkana, have sampled individuals from 3 different territorial sections, which is another social grouping that cross-cuts clans and is very salient in the Turkana context. And to measure cultural variation, we identified 49 cultural traits. So these are norms and beliefs. And we asked subjects if they agree or disagree with these statements. So if they agree, they're considered as having the cultural trait. If they disagree, they're considered as not, that individual is considered as not having this cultural trait. And to measure the scale of cooperation, we developed 16 vignette scenarios, and these were vignette scenarios that were all very relevant to pastoral contexts and are cooperative scenarios in which we have seen individuals helping in these contexts. So they're very culturally relevant vignette scenarios of either helping or another form of cooperation, which is not harming. So some of the vignettes were about helping, some of the vignettes were about not harming. And we varied who the target is. So in one condition, the target was from the same clan as the actor. In another condition, from a different clan as the actor, a different ethnic group as the actor, or in the case of the Turkana, a different territorial section than the actor. And then we examined whether, so we did 2 things. First, we estimated the cultural FST values based on the presence absence of traits. So we had individual level variation, and we knew people's clan affiliation, we knew people's territorial affiliation, and we knew the ethno-linguistic group affiliation. And so we calculated the pairwise cultural FST between clans within an ethno-linguistic group, between territorial sections of the Turkana, and between each pair of ethno-linguistic groups. And so essentially what you have here above this black line is the proportion of the variation, the cultural variation in these traits that can be explained by between group differences. Okay. So one thing to note first is that these values, especially between ethnolinguistic groups, which is what's shown in orange here, are substantially higher than estimates of genetic FST from the literature. So these are not FST values of the same groups that we studied, but of other groups for which researchers have data that have been published. And you can see that cultural FST values between ethnolinguistic groups is an order of magnitude higher. About 8 to 20% of the variation in cultural traits can be between ethnolinguistic groups. We don't see as much variation between clans and territorial sections. Those are more on the order of the genetic FST estimates from the literature. And the values for cultural FST that we obtained is comparable to values of cultural FST that have been obtained by other researchers who have looked at different societies using other kinds of traits. So what this result shows is that consistent with the predictions of cultural group selection theory, there is sufficient variation between groups at certain scales to at least make cultural group selection a much more important force than genetic group selection in shaping cooperation. And so the next question is, do we see the signature of such cultural group selection on the cooperative norms that people are displaying? And for that, I'll show you the relationship between cultural FST and the endorsements of the Cooperative Act. And that relationship controls for the geographic distance between groups. So if we're looking at clan level cooperation, we're looking at the distance between two clans of the same ethnolinguistic group. If we're looking at ethnolinguistic scale cooperation, of distance between ethnolinguistic groups. And what we essentially, the reason we're controlling for this is that you might think that people are more likely to cooperate with those who are close to them, geographically close to them, simply because that's more convenient. There are going to be markets in which they end up running into each other, etc. And interestingly, we didn't find a significant relationship between distance and the endorsements for the Cooperative Act, geographic distance. But we do see a strong and significant effect of cultural FST on the endorsements for cooperation. So as cultural FST increases, so that means as the cultural variation between groups increases, people are less likely to endorse a cooperative act towards a target who is from that group. And those cooperative acts involve both helping and involve also acts of not harming, refraining from harming. So this, taken together, these two results are consistent with the two predictions of cultural group selection that we laid out. Essentially, our measurements of cultural variation, at least between ethnolinguistic groups, are substantially higher than available genetic FST measurements. The scales at which individuals are cooperating then do map on to the variation in cultural relatedness. And what this implies is that cultural group selection is influencing the evolution of cooperative norms. So I will conclude by the implications of these results, both for cooperation and for human conflict. So a key implication for cooperation is that, consistent with a lot of the theoretical literature and a lot of work that's coming out of experimental fields like psychology, behavioral economics experiments, these, in some ways, I would call these measurements, field-based measurements of norms and behaviors, are suggesting that culture has relieved a major constraint on the evolution of cooperation. by conferring humans with cooperative norms that are evolving through cultural evolution, cultural group selection. But these cooperative norms and the moral sentiments that they then lead to tend to be culturally parochial. So we cooperate at very large scales, but there is a limit to what cultural evolutionary processes are producing in terms of the scale of cooperation. The implications for conflict. One is that I would argue that these results indicate that, in part, large-scale intergroup conflict is possible because of the evolution of culturally parochial cooperative norms. So the norms that we're seeing emerging in this decentralized population are norms that are supporting sanctioning of free riders. They are norms that promote pro-social punishment towards free riders. They're norms that deter antisocial punishment towards those who haven't committed a wrong. And they are norms that are culturally parochial, as I showed in the second part of the talk. So our ability to solve a collective action problem in warfare is deeply intertwined with our ability to cooperate with culturally similar individuals. And not only this, once you have this, large-scale intergroup conflict can fuel the evolution of culturally parochial norms by intensifying the competition between groups with different cultural norms. So warfare is both the product of cultural group selection, but also a very strong, potentially a very strong engine for cultural group selection to then further lead to the evolution of culturally group beneficial norms. And I will end with what I think is perhaps an open question in this area, which is, has gene culture co-evolution led to psychological dispositions for culturally parochial warfare? Or is human warfare behavior mainly the result of a general purpose norm adherence psychology? Because both of these are plausible, and I think we don't have as yet a very good understanding of whether humans have what some might call a war psychology, or whether all of human warfare behavior can be explained simply by adherence to the culturally evolved norms in people's local societies. Some of those norms might promote warfare, some of those norms might deter warfare in certain other contexts. Hence helping to perhaps explain a lot of the variation in warfare that we see across human societies. So with that, I will end thanking the host communities, the Turkana, Borana, Rendille, and Samburu communities, my field team, collaborators, Rob Boyd, Carla Handley, and Matt Zefferman, and various funding organizations that have supported this work.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. While people think about questions, let me ask you one. So how do they learn these norms? I mean, is it elders who teach kids how to behave? I mean, could you kind of say a few words about this?
Yeah. So when it comes to raiding-related actions, in particular, the age mates have a very strong role to play in educating a warrior. But I would say there are multiple facets. So basically, people from their childhood are listening to stories about Turkana raids of the past. They're listening to stories about, famous warriors and their brave acts. They're listening to the ridicule and criticism that's being directed at other individuals. And so there's a lot of input from all these stories of the past. But there's also, as the age group gets to be about 12, 13, 14 or so, they start going on raids as staff boys, in which they're essentially don't have weapons, but they're helping to drive away the cattle, standing in the back. And during this time, they learn a lot from their older brothers or older cousins who might be on the raid. Sometimes their fathers might be on the raid, and they can learn from them. But as they grow even older, it's really the age mates who play a very important role in encouraging other warriors who might be a little afraid, who might be new to the raid, etc. So they often will say, like, some people will say, I will stand next to a coward so that, I can teach him how to fight. But essentially, when they see that somebody is refusing then to make an effort to learn and be a brave warrior, that's when then they shift gears towards the criticism, etc. So in the context of raids, I would say that, older siblings and the stories, and then the actions, the encouraging actions, plus the admonishments of age mates and the actual disciplining by age mates plays a very important role.
Thank you very much. Okay, the first question, what is the social status of warriors among these people?
So this is something that I can give you an answer that's based just on general impressions, but I will say that one of my students, Liam Gleason, is actually going to do their dissertation work on this, assessing actually the reputational ranks of warriors, and seeing to what extent people's rank was acquired through their actions on raids, to what extent there's consistency across members of the age group. So in a couple of years, Liam Gleason will have actual data to speak to this. But my general impression is that brave warriors are highly, highly regarded in the society. They are people who killed enemies in warfare are allowed to scarify themselves in a particular way. And so they when somebody's walking around with those scars, everybody knows this is somebody who's done something important, something brave. On the flip side, cowards do have a lower status. People will say kind of, disparaging things towards him, but also that people have multiple different pathways by which they can attain status. So somebody might be a coward on raids, but he can actually increase his status by being generous, by being, somebody who makes good decisions about herding and who can guide other people regarding herding decisions, who donates animals when the raiding party is going on a feast, etc. So while raiding is a very important context by which people can gain status and importance, it's not the only context, and there's basically going to be a bunch of different factors that people take into consideration when they think about a person.
Thank you. Could you say a bit more about the scope of what kinds of behavior count as punishment and which don't? For example, it was interesting that on one of your slides, criticize was a separate category from punishment. Why doesn't doing reputational damage to a person count as a way of punishing?
Yeah, so I separated that because empirically, there seem to be the process of peer punishment takes the form where when you start off, there is a lot of talk and criticism. So basically the verbal sanctioning phase seems to be a conspicuously different phase in which part of the goal there is to sometimes provide a warning to the person, but also to elicit talk from other people, to hear what other people have to say about this. Because some people will say, no, I don't think so. I actually saw that he'd run out of bullets. That's why he ran away, kind of thing. So the goal of that stage is both first a kind of more lenient form of punishment, but it's also a way to like seek consensus from the community and decide whether the actual next stage of sanctioning needs to occur. And the next stage of sanctioning then that I call punishment is when there are actual material or potentially fitness costs associated with the action itself. So being beaten is a physical cost on the body, in addition to being a big source of shame. It is a physical cost, and then being asked to give up an animal from your herd is also then a material cost that somebody is experiencing. So what I call punishment here is basically referring to actions in which that action itself is producing a cost to a direct cost on that individual, whereas the verbal sanctioning phase, while it often kind of comes before the punishment, is not in and of itself a cost. Its cost is coming from the fact that, if you suffer these verbal sanctions, people are less likely to cooperate with you, or they're more likely to decide that you're going to have to face more serious, costly sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there patterns in when, how often these raids occur? Are they regular seasonal things, or do they occur under periods of stress and resource scarcity, during droughts, as local population sizes increase?
Yeah, so that is an intuition that people have, but I don't see a very clear pattern here. So during the wet season, when everybody is gathered and things are going well, that's a good time to launch a raid. People are together, they can collaborate, they can talk, they have enough. They're all in good health for launching a raid. And so sometimes, during wet season, people say, we haven't raided in a long time, or the other group has raided us recently and we never retaliated. It's time for us to go on a raid. Or they might hear about the opponents having settled in an area that's strategically a good area for them to launch an attack. And so they might do that. In the dry season, people are closer together. So the opponent's group and the Turkana are basically grazing in vying for areas that overlap. And so in order to get access to those territories, they might be motivated to launch a raid. So I see raids, I hear of raids happening both in dry season and wet season. Whether the rates are higher or lower in one or the other is hard to tell without much more data. But on the face of it, I think I don't think that that's a big factor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Have relatively recent technological developments, firearms, increased the risk of raiding, and has this resulted in a change in norms? For example, stronger punishment to encourage in face of much higher risk?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And I wish that, I was doing this work about maybe 15 years earlier. And if so, I would have been able to answer this question better. But by the time I started my field work, it had already been about 30 years since the Turkana had started to shift towards firearms. So the firearms started spreading in these areas in the late 70s onwards. And it spread to a lot of the pastoral groups in this area, the Dodos, the Taposa, the Nyangatom, the Turkana, Samburu, Pokot. And by the 80s, by the mid to late 80s, pretty much everybody had a firearm. And so I tried to get at accounts that, predated firearms, but the accounts were from very old people and they were too long ago. So it was hard to get consistent and reliable information on that. People say that one of the things that actually has changed with firearms is actually that the raiding parties have gotten smaller. So when they say that when they went on the stories that they have about these old Turkana raids, these battle raids, when they fought with spears, the raiding parties were actually bigger, like, few thousand, couple thousand people easily. And that firearms have kind of shifted towards smaller raiding parties. And then in terms of the norms about punishment, I simply don't know, because it's stories about raids transmit longer than stories about, whether somebody was punished on a raid. So people have a little bit more historic information about, that battle raid in which a couple thousand Turkana went, but they don't have similar kinds of stories about finer grained things. Mortality, again, I don't know. I do have a couple of individuals who've said that they've sustained injuries from spears. So there was definitely, people were dying, people were getting seriously injured. It's not that it was a kind of a unconsequential type of cooperative venture. And I also have an account of a woman having been speared in battle when the Turkana were being attacked. But in terms of the rate, how the rate has shifted, whether it has increased, decreased, I just simply don't have that data.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me ask you one more question from the audience, and I'll ask our panelists if we have any questions. How elaborate is warfare? Do we elaborate strategy? Who is commanding or planning the raids? Are there leaders and strategies? And if yes, who are they? How that status can be achieved? How, and more generally, how the hierarchy works among Turkana, regardless of war-related hierarchy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll give you a general sense of the hierarchies. When I say a politically decentralized society, what I'm saying is that no single individual has coercive authority. So a leader on his own cannot, a settlement leader, for instance, on his own cannot say, I want this person to be punished. The settlement leader can bring up the idea to his age mates. His age mates can discuss it and decide, no, we don't want to. It's his first time. We'll think about it. We'll keep an eye on him, that kind of stuff. Most of the punishment most of the coercive actions are coming from these communal deliberations. The main source of hierarchy is the age-based hierarchies. So essentially, men, when they get to their teens, they start getting formed into an age group. And the senior age groups technically have authority over the junior age groups in many matters. So junior age groups cannot sit at the same tree as, a group of seniors. And when it comes to sharing of the meat during a communal feast, the elders need to get certain shares. When it comes to adjudicating disputes, a lot of times elders are coming together in these types of informal courts. And then the elders seek input from all the stakeholders by, asking people who know about the case to speak up, asking the person who's accused, the accuser, to speak up. So the elders kind of coordinate, and it's usually a group, kind of like a council of elders. And in the context of raids, there are multiple kinds of raids. So some raids are organized by leaders, that is, famous warriors or a prominent member of a settlement who's emerged as a leader because, they've made good decisions in the past. They're respected by people. So you don't have inherited leadership here. And so some raids are organized like that, but some raids are organized just by a couple young scouts who've gone off to see what the opponent's territory looks like, where have they settled, and they come back and they say, we think it's a good time to launch a raid. So they might be the ones who initiate the raid, and then they're seen as the leaders of the raid, especially if they're known to be good warriors and know people who know the opponent's area well. And then some raids are organized by diviners. So these are people who people believe have dreams that allow them to foresee what will happen. And so diviners foresee that, the Turkana need to go here to this area. And those raids specifically have a lot of rituals associated with it that are specified by the diviner, that involve a lot of careful actions that the raiding party need to follow. So there's a multiplicity of ways in which a raid can be organized. There isn't like a single formula. And usually the people who start the organizing are seen as the leaders. The initiators of the raid are seen as the leaders. But then once those leaders are simply leaders of coordination. They talk, they speak, they give ideas for the plans. And then people from these age groups might have certain leaders or prominent individuals who then kind of help communicate those ideas to the age group and kind of create plans within the age group because the age group members stay together during the raids. So there are all these multiple layers of informal leadership, all of which are not inherited but are acquired in certain contexts. Somebody who might be a good warrior is not seen as somebody important to follow when it comes to herding decisions, for instance. So that hopefully gives you a rough idea.
Thank you. Let me ask our panelists. Pete? Yeah, Pete, please.
Yes, Sarah, what other domains of cooperation are important in the Turkana besides warfare, or is warfare really the dominant locus of cooperation, or are there other domains where it's important?
So warfare is definitely the main area in which people are doing a conspicuous form of collective action. So people are coming together in order to jointly produce something. But if we look at, but I would say that there are many other contexts in which there is large-scale cooperation going on, which are, the maintenance of law and order, the adjudication of disputes, all of which are involving participation from many different individuals, and the following of norms about not raiding the Turkana. Adherence to those norms and the punishment of individuals who are violating those norms is also then a form of large-scale cooperation. So, and then in more recent contexts, you see the Turkana very readily mobilize for protests against, government policies. So, taking to the streets to basically push back against interventions that are coming from the government, a lot of which sometimes has to do with disarming the Turkana, or sometimes pushing on governments and leaders to give them more protection, so to actually provide them with more safety against opponents who might come and attack them, etc. So and in terms of grazing commons, the Turkana, essentially, if you're born into a territorial section, that land is your grazing commons. So you can settle anywhere, you can graze your animals anywhere in those areas. But in order to go to other territorial sections, you basically will need to get permission from the elders. And during dry season, sometimes other territorial sections will come pushing into, your territorial section, in which case there's kind of some collective efforts to, negotiate agreements between the territorial sections about access to Turkana grazing lands.
Thank you. Marta, Tom, Manuel, Marta, yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for that talk. I thought it was fascinating. I have two very small questions. So I work way to the south in Turkana, and there any raiding is so much more exposed, and because the government cracks down on raiding, they have reduced in number, although they happen very occasionally, only now. So what is your opinion? I have some ideas from what I have seen, but what is your opinion of a developing new norm that establishes status among Turkana who are not allowed to raid, and yet they have retained everything else the same, more or less the same, although more settled in their society? And men, again, have to establish their status. So that is one question. And my other one is a little one, it's just in case you know. So among all the Turkana, you find both adult men who were the outcome of a raid, right? So there were enemies raided as children and brought up Turkana, and women who were, of course, raided, several of them. And my impression is that both the raiding of children and women has decreased substantially, at least in the southern bit, in the area next to the Pokot. What is yours? So there's just a
Yeah. So with regards to your first question, I think that's super interesting, and I think the shift in norms and being able to document the process by which those norms shift, I think is super interesting, and it's something I should do. Especially the areas that I worked in have really focused on kind of being able to access populations that have and are continuing to endorse warfare. I do work in one territorial section that's actually further away from the border, in which the people from there mostly don't go on raids themselves, and they are never being attacked. So this is the Ngiapakuno territorial section. And in that society, you don't see a shift away from raiding norms. So people there strongly endorse raiding. They think that, going to raid the Toposa is a very good thing to do, even though their own settlements are not being attacked when they're in Ngiapakuno area. But to be fair, though, they live just adjacent to the people who are then going on raids. So if I move further to the interior, I think that's a very interesting question, and I should start to look at that, because one of the forces is the nation state influence, and the integration into the nation state should predict differences in whether it's okay to raid, violate or disregard certain rules of the nation state, etc., and then seeing basically how this traditional system is decreasing in importance and getting replaced by some other normative landscape. I think that's super interesting. There are many areas in the south, though, where raiding is still going on because they border the Pokot, for instance, and so it's not just that it's in the north. In the north, there's raiding. In the south, there's raiding. Usually, wherever the Turkana are bordering other pastoralists, there's still enough raiding that it's normal to
still find raids.
Mm-hmm. But I agree with you that there are areas in which we might be able to start looking at these norm shifts. So I agree. Super interesting and something I should do. The second question about norms was about norms regarding attacking women and children during rape. Yeah. So interestingly, for this, I do have data through a project that I've done with Matt Zefferman about PTSD and moral injury, in which we try to look at what are norms about rating, essentially, like, are there moral norms? Are there norms that deter certain forms of violence against the opponent? And so Matt collected this data, and it looks like there's a lot more variation in norms about what you can do towards the outgroup than, the variation that you see within how do you treat another Turkana. And Matt has also suggested that there's a lot more variation in Turkana norms about rating other groups and what they can do towards other groups than there is in formal institutionalized military. So by and large, the folks that we talk to don't endorse. Some people say it's okay to attack women and children, especially because they say that when we get attacked, our women and children are being killed, and we need to retaliate similarly. But there are others who say that that's you don't want to do that. That's not the purpose of the raid. We focus on the armed men, and sometimes they say you can focus on the younger boys who might grow up to be warriors. But there is
it wasn't so much attacking them; it was kidnapping.
Oh, kidnapping. Yeah. So. I'm seeing very, very low instances of kidnapping that are being reported. So in about 150 interviews, we've only gotten maybe one or two, and those are actually not of women. They are of young boys for herding labor. And so it doesn't seem against the rules, but it's also not very common, and it doesn't seem like most people want to do that. And it's actually during peace agreements then between the Turkana and the Toposa, one of the first things that happens is basically the returning of somebody who's been taken. It certainly doesn't seem like a very commonly followed norm, being able to kidnap.
Thank you. Let me ask you just one more question, and then we'll let you go. Do any of these ethnic groups have real histories of conflict competition with each other? Could that be part of the judgment of how threatening these outgroups were beyond just cultural distance?
Can you repeat that?
Well, so I think the question is it, can it be just history of past conflicts between different ethnic groups?
Yeah, so...
that explains...
Yeah, so in some ways I would say that the goal then is to try to explain why that history is the way it is, because the pastoralists, if they want to get cattle, there's a lot of cattle nearby. They can go to neighboring territories. They can go to, the far end of their ethnolinguistic group, still raid cattle from, the people that are being called their own. And the fact that they don't do that, and they're traveling long distances, 3 days, 4 days sometimes, in order to acquire cattle, passing up on all the cattle that's there on the way, is partly, I think, what needs to be explained. But you are right that if suppose none of this is right and there's some other process that can explain why groups are fighting against each other, then the history of past wars will play a role in the sense that you don't feel good towards people who have attacked you, and that could be one explanation. That said, these groups they're not all living close to each other. So they all share a border, and there's raiding going on between, pairs of groups. But, the Turkana that we sampled from here have never been raided by the Borana. They've actually maybe sometimes been raided. The central Turkana have been maybe raided by the Samburu, but it's not that every pair of groups have raided each other.
Thank you. Well, Sarah, we have more questions, but I think we should stop here now. And thank you again for a very informative talk, a great discussion.
Thank you. That was really fun.
Everybody, and we'll hope to see you next week here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions.
Good day.